Most people assume that feeling safe means being around others. Friends, family, familiar faces, noise, presence. Safety in our culture is almost always associated with connection. But psychologists have noticed something unusual. Some people feel calmer when they're alone, not lonely, not isolated, safe. For them, being alone feels more predictable than being close to people, more stable, more controllable. And this has nothing to do with hating others or being antisocial. It usually begins much earlier than most people realize. For these individuals, solitude isn't emptiness, it's regulation. When they're alone, nothing suddenly shifts. No moods to interpret, no emotional undercurrents to monitor, no expectations waiting to be met or missed. Their system finally rests. This pattern rarely begins with a single dramatic event. There's no obvious moment where trust breaks. Instead, it forms quietly, through emotional inconsistency, through affection that appeared unpredictably, through care that depended on timing, energy, or circumstance. Nothing overtly harmful, just nothing solid. So the nervous system adjusted. If closeness couldn't be relied on, distance would have to be. Over time, the body learned something the mind doesn't consciously record. Closeness requires vigilance. Distance allows release. So independence becomes a form of safety, not the confident kind, the protective kind. These people often appear easygoing. They rarely ask for reassurance. They don't place heavy emotional demands on others. They seem self-contained. But that self-containment didn't come from abundance. It came from restraint, from learning early that needing too much came with risk. Crowded environments tend to exhaust them quickly, not because of noise, but because of emotional density. Too many signals, too many unspoken cues. But late at night, when the world quiets and expectations dissolve, their body softens. That calm isn't loneliness, it's relief. This isn't simple introversion. Introverts enjoy solitude, but they can move freely toward connection. For these individuals, closeness activates something else, a subtle alertness. The body tightens slightly. The mind begins scanning, not for danger, but for emotional shifts. Their system prepares for disruption. What triggers this response isn't the present moment. It's memory, not visual memory, emotional memory. Moments when reassurance wasn't met, when feelings were expressed and left hanging, when dependence quietly turned into disappointment. The body remembers what the mind has normalized. As they grow older, this adaptation becomes identity. I'm just independent. I don't really need anyone. I function better on my own. Sometimes that's true, but often independence isn't freedom. It's armor. They can enjoy people. They can enjoy intimacy, even depth. But when relationships begin to require sustained vulnerability, something shifts. Space starts to feel necessary. Distance feels regulating, and retreat feels instinctive, not as rejection, as preservation. So proximity is managed carefully. Connection is allowed, but only to a point. Enough to feel human, never enough to feel exposed. They don't consciously plan this. Their system does. Solitude becomes the safest environment because it demands nothing. No emotional labor, no monitoring, no anticipation, just presence without pressure. This is why being alone feels safer for some people. Not because they lack the capacity for love, but because love once felt unstable. Not because they don't care, but because caring once required too much vigilance. There's often an unspoken grief beneath this pattern, a grief for closeness that never felt dependable, a grief for connection that always required self-protection. But that grief rarely surfaces, because independence is praised. Low need is rewarded. Self-sufficiency is admired. So the pattern hides in plain sight. Over time, the cost becomes visible. Relationships that never fully deepen. Connections that stall at a safe distance. A persistent sense of something missing, but unreachable. It's important to say this clearly. Feeling safer alone does not mean something is wrong with you. It means your nervous system learned how to survive emotional unpredictability. It adapted intelligently. The problem isn't solitude. Solitude can be restorative, necessary, healthy. The problem arises when solitude becomes the only place where safety exists, when connection always feels like a threat, when closeness triggers withdrawal by default, when peace only happens in isolation. At that point, protection becomes limitation. What once kept you stable begins to keep you separate. Understanding this pattern isn't about forcing connection or judging yourself for needing distance. It's about recognizing where that safety instinct came from, because awareness creates options. When you understand why closeness feels unsafe, you can begin to explore connection slowly, without abandoning yourself, not rushing, not forcing, not overriding your system, just expanding the definition of safety. Some people don't choose solitude because they want to be alone. They choose it because it's the only place where nothing suddenly goes wrong. And once that truth is understood, solitude no longer has to be a refuge. It can become a choice.